The email arrived at 2:13 in the morning, and by the time Daniel finished reading it, his hands were shaking. After 3 years of sleepless nights, countless hours of editing, and every last hope he had poured into their YouTube channel, one cold sentence seemed to erase everything: your channel has been demonetized. He stared at the screen, waiting for the words to change, but they didn't. Beside him, his wife Emma was asleep on the old sofa, exhausted after another 14-hour day at her regular job. Daniel slowly lowered his phone and looked around the tiny apartment that had become their home, their office, and sometimes their entire world. The computer on the desk was still running. The editing timeline was open. Their latest video was almost ready. And suddenly, Daniel wondered if there was any point in finishing it. If you believe stories about compassion, second chances, and people who refuse to give up when life knocks them down, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach people who may be silently fighting their own battles. 3 years earlier, Daniel and Emma had started their channel with almost nothing. They didn't have expensive cameras, a studio, or a team. They had one second-hand laptop, a cheap microphone, and a simple idea: tell stories about ordinary people who had been given a second chance. Their videos focused on kindness, forgiveness, family struggles, and moments when strangers helped one another. At first, almost nobody watched. Daniel would spend an entire weekend editing a video that received 23 views. Sometimes Emma would wake up in the middle of the night and find him staring at the analytics page, hoping the numbers had moved. But they kept going. They believed that even if only one person watched a story and felt less alone, the work mattered. Slowly, things changed. One video about an elderly shopkeeper helping a homeless teenager unexpectedly reached thousands of viewers. Then another story took off. Subscribers began arriving every day. Comments filled their screen with messages from people saying the stories had reminded them of their parents, their children, or someone they had lost. For the first time, Daniel and Emma felt that their little channel had become something bigger than a source of income. It had become a place where people came to feel something. When their first significant payment arrived from YouTube, Daniel printed the confirmation email and taped it above the desk. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to cover groceries and a few bills. Emma cried when she saw it. They had spent years wondering whether their dream could survive, and suddenly it seemed possible. Daniel reduced his hours at his old job, and Emma began helping with research and editing after work. Their tiny apartment became a chaotic production room filled with notebooks, hard drives, coffee cups, story ideas, and piles of paperwork. Then came the video that changed everything. It was one of their most emotional stories, about a struggling family finding hope after losing almost everything. They had spent weeks researching it, rewriting it, and carefully editing every scene. The video exploded. Hundreds of thousands of people watched it. Their subscriber count climbed faster than they could believe. Daniel thought they had finally made it. But success brought something else. A few weeks later, they received a warning. Certain videos had been flagged for content issues. Daniel reviewed everything carefully. He removed anything he believed might cause problems and changed their approach. He thought they had fixed it. Then, without warning, came the email. Demonetized. Their income disappeared almost overnight. Daniel sat silently at the desk until Emma woke up. When she saw his face, she immediately knew something was wrong. She read the email and sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The room felt unbearably quiet. On the desk was the printed payment confirmation from 3 years earlier, now slightly yellow around the edges. Daniel looked at it and whispered that perhaps they had been foolish to believe they could build something lasting. The next morning, reality became heavier. Rent was due. Electricity was due. Emma's workplace had recently reduced her hours. Their savings were already thin because they had invested much of their income back into the channel. Daniel opened the analytics page several times, but the numbers no longer felt exciting. They felt like reminders of everything they might lose. For the first time since they started, Daniel didn't want to make another video. Emma noticed. Instead of telling him to be positive, she quietly sat beside him and opened the folder containing hundreds of comments from viewers. She showed him messages from people who had watched their stories during difficult nights. One person had written that their video had helped them forgive a family member. Another said the channel had given them courage to start over. Someone else simply wrote, "Thank you for reminding me that good people still exist." Daniel read the messages one by one. Then he realized something painful but important. They had spent so much time measuring success through views and revenue that they had forgotten why they started. So they decided to continue. They couldn't afford their old equipment, so Daniel sold a camera lens he had bought with his first big payment. Emma picked up extra hours at work. They stopped ordering takeout. They turned one corner of their apartment into a makeshift recording space. Daniel appealed the demonetization decision and began studying every guideline he could find. They changed how they researched stories, improved their editing process, and became much more careful about the content they published. But the hardest part was continuing when nobody could guarantee that things would get better. Weeks passed. Then months. Some videos performed badly. Others did reasonably well. The channel didn't return to its old success immediately. But something unexpected happened. Their audience became more loyal. Viewers noticed the struggle behind the scenes. People began sharing the stories not because they were trending, but because they genuinely connected with them. One evening, almost 6 months after the demonetization, Daniel received another email. His heart stopped for a moment. He opened it expecting another warning. Instead, the message informed him that the channel had been reviewed again and was eligible for monetization. Daniel stared at the screen. He read it twice. Then he called Emma. She ran into the room, and when she saw his expression, she covered her mouth with both hands. They hugged in silence. There were no cameras, no audience, and no dramatic music. Just two exhausted people standing in a tiny apartment, crying because something they had nearly abandoned had finally been given another chance. But Daniel didn't celebrate the way he imagined he would. He walked to the desk, looked at that old printed payment confirmation, and took it down from the wall. Then he replaced it with something else, a handwritten note that simply said, "The numbers can disappear. The reason must remain." The channel eventually grew again, but Daniel and Emma never forgot those 6 months. They learned that losing income wasn't the same as losing their purpose. They learned that failure could interrupt a dream without necessarily ending it. And most importantly, they learned that sometimes a second chance doesn't arrive as a miracle. Sometimes it arrives disguised as one more difficult morning when you decide to keep going. If this story touched your heart, please don't just watch silently. Like the video, share it with someone who may be struggling, and subscribe to Stories of Compassion. One small interaction can help this story reach another person who needs to hear that their hardest chapter does not have to be their final chapter. And before we end, I want to ask you something special. Comment, "I will keep going," if you believe that setbacks can become new beginnings. Because maybe somewhere tonight, someone is staring at their own version of that terrible email. Maybe their dream has fallen apart. Maybe they believe it's too late to start again. And if this story has taught us anything, it is this: sometimes life closes one door so quietly that we mistake it for the end. But it may only be the moment before we find another way forward. YouTube demonetized them. It took away their income. It shook their confidence. But it could never take away the reason they began. And that was the one thing that saved them.